What's poppin'? Miss Evans on the beat, so tap in. You got options, but you better pass my class, no flopping. Gon' log in every day, every morning I'm watching. Yeah, we virtual and you know it's up, so we about to take it up a notch. Yeah. My role is the best, no comparing.
Welcome to Perspectives On, where we're giving the world a voice. I'm Larry Lane White, your host. And we want to thank the artist, who's a teacher down in Albany, Georgia, for that wonderful intro. But many of the nation's schools, both private and public, are going back into session, as you know, have been back into session since probably a little better than a week now. And they are in a state of shock because of all of the controversy around COVID-19 and how COVID-19 is affecting school instruction. And as you know, COVID-19 shocked the nation's education system. First, by forcing schools to close right in the middle of the spring cycle. And secondly, by sparking a number of heated debates on whether or not they should resume school or whether or not they should, or if they should open up the doors. There's a lot of information, a lot of decision making, and a lot of controversy around the school system. And as a result, hard information on schools reopening has been very limited. As a professional in ministry, I've raised both questions and concerns about the perspective or the lack thereof that our churches and mainline denominations have taken over this very important issue. Some have asked, what informs my perspective on education? Well, I've spent the first 12 years of my career as an educator. 10 of those years working specifically with children with disabilities, and 2 as an administrator over programs for children with disabilities. So why haven't more churches utilized their resources to provide alternatives and supportive services to our parents? What about the mainline denominations? Most have both the infrastructure as well as the resources. So why don't they use their resources to develop things like micro-learning environments for school-aged children and for high school students? These are the questions that I ask. Why is the church, particularly those churches serving communities of color, remaining virtually silent in this ongoing debate, while politicians and some educators politicize the wearing of masks? Reports from across the country are proving that exposing our nation's most valuable assets to a potentially deadly virus can bring heavyweight consequences. After a summer-long debate over whether or not to open schools, school systems, colleges, and universities across the globe are now facing the reality of shifting their entire experience to virtual platforms. This reality is an urgency for parents, as well as educators, as well as students, to feel supported by their education system. Well, as a professional in the ministry, I question the church leaders across denominations. What are they doing to encourage collaboration between themselves and to support the communities that need help with their education? Tonight, I have invited a number of a number of pastors, preachers, who are doing just that. They are moving and shaking in their respective denominations, and they are setting an example for those persons, those church leaders, and those pastors that are providing some type of a supportive service for those for parents and educators alike. And we're gathered here tonight to talk about some solutions, not just focus on the problems, but to talk about some solutions to what's going on in the education landscape. And I'll let each one of them introduce themselves. Reverend Christmas, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing?
Thank you, Dr. White. My name is Mark Christmas. I've been in ministry going on 21 years. I've been pastoring 17 years. I pastored in South Georgia, down in Valdosta for some time. Then I came to Atlanta to St. John. I went to Haddock, Georgia, and now I'm at Sparta, in Sparta, Georgia, one of the poorest counties in the state of Georgia. I came into education because a friend asked me to come help him. I came into education because a friend asked me to help him with some kids, and the normal typical preacher. I don't really want to be bothered right now, but he was a great friend of mine, and so I came in and started helping with the kids as a graduation coach, and done that for a while. Then I saw a area where I could be over safe and drug-free schools for the entire county, and I went with that. And then there was a shift in the economy, and they had to move some people. And so then I decided to run for the Board of Education for Clayton County Public Schools while I was attending ITC, graduating with my Master's of Divinity. The year I graduated with my Master's of Divinity, I won the board seat for District 2, and I have been on the school board now for 9 years, and I'm going into my third term, and I thank you for inviting me.
All right. Very impressive. Pastor Houston, can you talk to us a little bit about who you are and, just toot your horn, girl?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Reverend Conitras Houston, known as Pastor C. I am the senior pastor of Trinity AME Early Learning Center, senior pastor of Trinity AME Church in Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, and the board chair of Trinity AME Early Learning Center, which is the business side of our church. Our learning center is 51 years old. The church is 145 years old. I'm the first female and youngest pastor to serve this congregation in Southwest Atlanta, and excited to be on this panel tonight because we are in the midst of trying to make sure that we continue to meet the needs of our community and of the educational system in this difficult season.
Awesome. Let's see. Reverend Fortson.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. White, thank you for this invitation tonight. It's so good to see everybody on the line. I'm Dr. Paul Q. Fortson, and I'm the founder or the president and chief operating officer for the Paradise Community Development Corporation there in Clayton County, where Brother Christmas, Pastor Christmas, serves on the board. I'm a teacher by trade. I've worked in the school systems, the Atlanta Public School System, the Fulton County. I've worked in the Orleans Parish School System when I lived in New Orleans. And so I've been teaching, been in some way, shape, or form in education and in the education system since probably I was about 22. I know, I'm not close to 22 now. But for over 15 years, I've been in the nonprofit work there in the Clayton County community with the Paradise Community Development Corporation. And we do so many things that help the community by ways of education, but because we do an annual health fair, we do a huge back to school bash, we do a lot of youth sports, and we're still doing our mentoring program and for both boys and girls, even through the pandemic, we've been doing it virtually. A few weeks ago, or last month rather, I was very excited about the fact that we were able to provide free COVID-19 testing for our community. And we were able to provide this sort of unique thing. And I know the Board of Health doesn't like it a lot, but we did a walk-up testing. And so I'm excited about what we have been able to do during the pandemic and what we've been able to provide, but also what the future of this new normal looks like in the community. So again, thank you for this invitation tonight.
Awesome. Reverend Powers, soon to be Dr. Powers, will you do the honors of introducing yourself?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. White, for inviting me. I'm the Reverend Esther K. Powers. I'm the senior pastor of Mount Zion AME Church in College Park, Georgia. I so share with my sister, Pastor C, as being the first female pastor of the church in its 20-year history. And so we're starting some new ministries. I retired from corporate about 4 years ago. Well, 6 years ago. Wow, time has passed. And I've been dabbling in the nonprofit ever since. And so when I got to Mount Zion, and as we looked and moved into, I've been there for 1 year. And so right now we have started a ministry called Serve First, because we are called to be servants first. And out of that ministry, there are a couple of things that we have been able to get off the ground, even in the midst of COVID-19. And one of those has been, we have started a virtual learning academy called Serve First Virtual Learning Academy, where we are serving grades 1 through 6 there in the Clayton County, Whitneyville Road area. So, you know, if you're interested, you can give us a call at 404-548-8169. We'll be glad to share information with you about it. But what was interesting was when it was put in my spirit to do this, as schools begin to prepare to go back, because we don't have an ongoing childcare program as Trinity does. So we had to ramp up very rapidly, find out what we had to do through all of the systems with right from the start. And I was like, what is going to happen to kids who do not have internet access, parents that have to go to work as our country was opening back up? How are they going to leave first graders at home to get on the system by themselves? And these parents don't have a choice, because if they don't work, they don't have their rent, they don't have food. And our economy was not making it even feasible for them to continue to have any options. And so God put it in my spirit. I have 2 retired educators from Fulton County who in any other world would be considered at risk in the definition of COVID, but they were willing to step out on faith and do this ministry. And we're so excited for what is happening and the kids that have come to the ministry.
Awesome. We'll talk a little bit more about what about ministry later on. Right now, though, Dr. Henderson, why don't you talk to us about, introduce to the viewers, to our viewers, who you are and what you've been doing in ministry.
My name is Brian Henderson. I am the pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Charleston, South Carolina, on James Island. It's a 154-year-old congregation. It's been here for a very long time and continues to do ministry in this community. I also serve as a member of the steering committee for the Charleston Area Justice Ministries Education Committee, education arm, where our current focus is working with the Charleston County School District and implementing restorative practices into schools. Right now, as it stands, and the African-American students in the Charleston County School District are suspended 10 times more regularly than non-African-American students. And so we've been working to try to get restorative practices implemented as a better way of managing outcomes in classrooms. Like many of you on the ministry side, we have given away food multiple times. We also have an intensive mentoring program here called A+, where we actually work with teachers and students and screen the students very closely to fit in the program and then bring them on after interviewing them and the parents. And then lastly, we have also, like I think one of the brothers said, provided COVID-19 training. I mean, not training, but testing here as well. Has been a site for that, and it served this community well. So that's where we are.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, and thank you for being a part of this conversation tonight. Before we get more specifically into what your churches are doing, I'm interested in knowing what is your perspective. Anyone can answer this question. What is your perspective on why church leaders and congregations are remaining silent on this issue of education and what's going on with the education landscape? Anybody can start that conversation.
Well, Dr. White, I think a lot of it goes back to our society. Society has made a clear line in the sand that we separate church and state. We've taken prayer out of the schools. And so there seems to be a disconnect between churches and schools even before COVID happened. And so I think our mind does not even look at how do churches partner with schools, because it sort of has been an unacceptable norm even before COVID. And so therefore, I think it has to be an effort put forth by faith leaders and educational leaders. I'm really excited because this is the second church I've pastored in Clayton County. And one thing I will say about the superintendent there, he has been very intentional about reaching out to the faith community. He actually has a faith advisory board that I serve on. And so he wants to hear from the faith community. Now, that is not the case in all counties. So I think that's probably been one of the challenges. And so we just adopted the mindset, the schools don't want us in them. And so therefore we don't reach out, and the schools are not reaching out to us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I would say that's one of the issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the issue also has to do with the training of clergy. I think that, looking at this group, I don't think it's a coincidence that we have one person who retired out of corporate America and two people who work in areas of nonprofit who know how to think strategically long term. And I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, Pastor, not Memphis. So I think that I don't think it's a coincidence. I think a lot of the training that we receive in seminary, in modern seminary, is chaplaincy training, and we are not necessarily trained. Now, I'm lucky. I had a mentor who taught me how to think strategically, who taught me the questions to answer now while nothing's going on, so that you're ready for tomorrow. But I can't think of a course that we took in seminary that taught us how to think strategically 5 or 10 years down the line. Thank you. We weren't trained like that. And so again, I was fortunate to have somebody who trained me, and then surround myself with people who thought like that. But most of the time we are focused on caring for the sick, preaching, doing those things that are specifically religious. And then we see an idea somewhere else and we say, oh, that's a good idea, we ought to do that. We're not trained often to think like that. And I think that that's a challenge that theological education needs to address. How do we create strategic leaders? And also one more thing, I don't think it's coincidence that many of the pastors that are doing larger scale things, like many of these pastors they did not attend traditional seminary. They came to the work that they do from another route where they were taught to think strategically. So I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. White, I think that what Pastor Powers and Pastor Henderson has said is spot on. Definitely about priorities or what they find we can put our minds to. But I also think, in my 2 cents, is that we've had an adversarial relationship, the church and education, for the last couple of generations. I know that was very important to many of those who preceded us, but for the last, it's always been such this adversarial relationship. And I'm glad that our organization has had a very vigilant initiative for education, because we adopted Lake City Elementary there in Clayton County as our school. So we've definitely had that, and then we have a charter school and a private school, and I think that we've done it. But I don't know if this adversarial relationship, if we've passed that. But then, as you have mentioned about silence by the Black community, I think a lot of, in this pandemic, what a lot seems like is silence. I think a lot of it is survival. I think a lot of those who would have put efforts into education are just trying to survive in the middle of this pandemic now. And that when it comes to priorities, they're just trying to be alive when all of this is over, as opposed to doing some of these other things that would help the community. You know, when it comes to education and those kinds of things, I think we left it to the public school system because a lot of churches are just trying to still be around when all of this is over.
And Dr. Fortson, that does lend itself to what Dr. Henderson was saying earlier about the orientation
strategically.
of the leadership. And you know, a lot of pastors, especially in pastor generations prior to ours, they a lot of them didn't necessarily go to seminary, especially in the African American church. And so, and they didn't come out of the military, or they didn't come out of the corporate setting. And so, you know, the thinking is not as informed as it would be in some ministries. But to me, that doesn't let the larger mainline denominations off the hook, because they have the resources. They certainly have the money, they have the property, they have the facilities, they have the ability to employ and seek out those resources.
And also, let me say this practically. So I came up in the Holiness Pentecostal Church, and the edict was the Spirit led you to do what it is you do. Whatever the Spirit put on your mind and on your heart, that's what you did. And all those degrees, all that education didn't really matter. And I don't mean to speak in general of all Holiness Pentecostal churches. I know that there are some great ones out there that have great initiatives with education, but I think that was the general attitude, even in the church I grew up in. So I completely agree with what you said, even as it relates to the larger mainline denominations. I know that that was something that I heard growing up.
Yeah, I think we've all heard that. Anybody else have anything to offer about that? Because it's so important to I've always been kind of critical of.
Well, one of the interesting things, I had a discussion in this group that I'm in today. It's a pastor's cohort through the Presbyterian Church. It's called Macedonia Ministry. And it was very interesting. We got to talking about engagement. And one of the things that came up with this whole concept in the Old Testament about temple worship. And I think that's some of what we have within a lot of our churches. So with temple worship.
That's good.
And we think the only place that we're going to experience the presence of God is in the temple.
My Lord.
And so therefore we never want to leave the temple, and we don't think God is anywhere else but in the temple. But then Jesus told us to do. He said, go. And so we're still sitting in the temple waiting on God to show up. Many of us are still sitting, waiting to go back to the temple. And I said very plainly today, my language has changed. I do not talk to my members about going back to the temple or going back to the church, because we will not go back to what used to be. If we do not shift our paradigm out of this, then, I don't know what will get our attention. So I think that's the problem, is sometimes that we have just become comfortable, as another terminology was used. We don't want to leave Pharaoh's house. We're comfortable.
Amen.
And for us to go out, that means we gotta leave the air conditioning. We gotta stand outside for a little while. Somebody's children that may not have all of the things that we are accustomed to. And I think that's a challenge for the mainline denominational church. We have become temple worshipers. And
Dr. White, let me just be clear. Why the Black church is, and this is my personal opinion, is silent. It's because of greed.
Greed.
Greed. We want everything and don't want to give out nothing. Our problem with that is in our structure, in my structure, the AME Church, we are excess fees and in excess because there's needs of the Episcopal office and the presiding elders, and they put their little bit on it, and then the church suffers because the smaller churches suffer because they're not raising the kind of money that they need to raise in order to be effective in ministry. I just so happen to pastor an educated church in Sparta where the educators go, so it doesn't impact me as much. And so what we're doing, and we've been doing this before COVID, we started a tutorial program, and we started buying 4 laptops every quarter. We didn't even have internet service in our community, so the church got internet service just so kids could come to the church and do work. We have to quit being so selfish with our things and stuff and start pouring back into people. And if you can't pour back into your community or your kids or your schools, then that's a problem. And the reason most of us can't pour back in it because we're paying out more than we could. We build all these elaborate buildings, and you know you couldn't pay for it in the first place, and then something happened like COVID, and now you really can't pay for it, and now you stretched and you can't do nothing for your community or your kids. Let me get off my horse.
Chris, so if y'all mind, so I hear everyone, and I think that this question is a dangerous one because the 5 of us are on here because we're not silent, and you know, so at Trinity we have what we call the Bridge Lab. So very similar to my sister Reverend Powers, is the learning lab for kindergarten to 12-year-olds, so 5-year-olds, 12-year-olds, to come and to, you know, have supervised learning time with their virtual learning. However, we were in a unique capacity because as Reverend Esther acknowledged in her opening comment, you know, Trinity had a 50, you know, when I arrived, Trinity's Learning Center was 48 years old. And so there was some revamping and some reworking that we needed to do, and we were able to accomplish those things. And because the Learning Center was so established in the community and had a reputation, we were able to recover from the pandemic, and even after being closed for 8 weeks strong, 8 solid weeks, I was able to keep my employees employed, keep them paid, and then recover because we're a quality rated learning center. So there were funds out there available to us even while we were closed. Versus on yesterday, I went to, and I don't want to say the institution, but a Black, large denomination based early learning center that was only 3 years younger than Trinity. And I went there because they called me and said, we're closing our doors and we want to make Trinity the beneficiary of these items that we will no longer have need of because we no longer keep our learning center open. And so I don't think that churches aren't answering because they don't want to. Sometimes, and I think Dr. Fortson said this, sometimes they don't answer because they can't. And maybe the money is not the issue, but the ability or the knowledge base or the resources is the issue. And just because you have money, it doesn't mean you have the resource. And so, you know, as a young adult, as a millennial who, although I'm now, 12 years removed from being a seminary graduate, you know, I have my own nonprofit that I started, that I founded independent of church and everything else, you know, 16 years ago. And so I have connections to individuals outside of my local congregation, it then allowed me to tap into those resources and say, hey, like Reverend E, you're a retired educator. I would love to employ you in the Bridge Lab. Hey, you're a young adult who is innovative. I would love to employ you in the Bridge Lab because you would know how to work this technology if my older retired educator can't. And so the resources were there. It wasn't just that the money was there, because the money wasn't necessarily there for the Bridge Lab to meet this need that we're in, but the resources were there because, you know, of my connections. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that that there is not just a money thing. And my nonprofit is Gabriel's House Incorporated. It's a nonprofit youth center where we focus on life skills training and performing arts. So we're in our 16th year of doing performing arts ministry, and we had to do it virtual for the first time in 16 years. So, you know, establishing that in the ground up, from the ground up at 21, and not having any idea what I was doing, just had a couple of older adults who believed in me and said, okay, we'll be around while you take all these children in and teach them mime, dance, and drama. And so then now in 2020, on the cusp, I get with the rest of my team and say, we're gonna host this virtually this year. And so then, of course, you can launch a Bridge Lab and a learning center that was only traditional. But in the same place, I kept my learning center completely traditional. So we have 2 pre-K classrooms, but we kept them traditional because the schools are virtual. And so, like Reverend Esther said, there are families who don't have the luxury of sending home with their pre-K students, and our Bridge Lab is not meeting the needs of pre-K, right? And so then we took the risk, reopened our learning center and tapped into the legal people that we have relationships with, and the CDC people that we have relationships with, to say, what's your advice on going above and beyond to make our learning center safe? And so I think that we've got to be careful when we answer that question, that we are not so critical, because sometimes the answer is not in because I didn't want to, because I was scared to, but maybe I just didn't know how, and I just didn't have the resources.
Mm-hmm. And I think
I jump in real quick because I need to go just real quick.
Go ahead.
I would just like to piggyback on that. I don't know of a pastor or a church that's saying we don't want to help.
Right.
Sometimes they just don't know how to help, or they don't,
Right.
as Pastor Fortson said, they're just trying to make it, you know, somehow. And so I think that the silence has to do with the shock, with the anxiety. But again, without the as Pastor Houston just mentioned, I mean, you know, without the vision mind, it all rests on leadership. It rises and falls on leadership, on a person who's willing to say, okay, let's talk about how we design a program. There's no program. Well, how do we design one? Well, I don't know if we can do that, boss. Yes, we can. Let's figure it out. If we start with 2, we start at 4, 6. It's about having vision and being leaders in that. And I think once you can pass that hurdle, you know, I think answer better. And so, but I need to run. I thank you guys. You guys are amazing. Every one of y'all gonna get called in my prayers tonight. All right.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. We appreciate your perspective, and we'll see you next time for sure.
Come on, bring me back. I would love to. Bless you guys. The old man is leaving.
Bless you.
Also, Pastor Houston, I know you might have to sign off a little early. Also, I want to thank you for what you're doing, and you've described 2 ministries that you have that are certainly making a contribution to the education landscape, and the entire purpose of this broadcast is so that we can show some examples to those churches that are not doing anything of how they can. Like, you know, sometimes you don't know. It's not that you don't want to, like Dr. Henderson say, they don't know how to. And so that is what our aim is tonight. And so you described your 2 ministries, and you even commented that you did something very controversial, and that was to keep your pre-K classes open in a traditional format, even in the midst of it. So you did that. But you were following the CDC guidelines, and you were reaching out to your legal guidelines. And so that's an example of when you do what you're supposed to do, then yes, you can have a school. What we're seeing now on the education landscape, particularly in the universities, is that a lot of the administrators are not, there's a disconnect between the administrators and the students in terms of how they're supposed to go about doing things. And so that's where you see the uptick, that's where you see the cases of the positive cases, etc. So the key thing for this segment is that as church leaders, we are presenting some ideas to church leaders, to the world, on how they can, as a church community, get involved. And you've certainly done that. And we appreciate what you shared with us, Pastor Houston.
Thank you. And as I run to this revival, let me also say, and Reverend Esther can kind of talk when I'm in my absence, but the other piece is when we talk about how we do it, also not being afraid to ask questions, right?
Just so, don't say that.
So Reverend Esther reached out to me and was like, hey, and I mean, I failed to get her contact information that she was looking for, so I apologize for that. But she was like, hey, do you have contact information for person X, Y, and Z? Because I'm trying to do A, B, and C. Or like there's another AME pastor who reached out to me and said, hey, I saw your Bridge Lab flyer. Can you tell me steps 1 through 10? Because I want to try to do something like that out here.
Right.
You know, and so we got to be in a place where we will set our pride aside as well and not be afraid, number one, to ask each other for help. And then number two, not be afraid to offer it if we know it. If we got a solution, offer it to somebody so they can offer it too, you know?
Right.
Because we're out here trying to do the same thing. We're not in competition, we're in collaboration.
That's correct. So Pastor C.
Yeah.
So you said 1 through 10, you have that written down on paper somewhere,
right? Hey, Mark. Hey, as they say, shoot your shot, Mark. Shoot your shot.
That's a quick email. That's a quick
1 through 10.
Why reinvent the wheel? She just said it. If you got it, why reinvent the wheel?
Absolutely.
Well, and that's so true, and it's so true for our churches that, as she said, we should be collaborating, not competing.
That's
right. But a lot of times we are and I say we to be inclusive and not to like specify anyone. We enter into that spirit of competition. Like if I share this success story with somebody else, then my success is going to be diminished. And we're blessed to be a blessing. And so even with me not knowing what I was doing, but once I started putting the flyers out there, I got calls from people like, oh, I've been thinking about that. What did you do? How did you get started so quickly? And I said, well, listen, I will not profess to tell you I really know what I'm doing, but God has shown favor. And I will forward you an email with all of the contacts, all of the emails, all the phone numbers that I use to get to where I am today. And, and wish you much success because, I'm here on the south side of Atlanta. You out there in Decatur. So you can go ahead and make it greater in Decatur. And I'm going to hang here on the south side. We're not. There are too many children. There's like, how many children in the, just in one school system, 100 and something thousand kids. So, there's enough of them to go around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Correct.
In the AME church, we have this saying that we're a connectional church. And so we need to be connectional and come together. Just like, we come together to have state meetings. We come together to make sure, the budget is paid. We come together on all these other things, but on the things that really count the most. And our children are our most valuable asset. So definitely, the examples that you guys are providing tonight are hopefully will encourage somebody out here who's a church member or a church leader to say, hey, we can do this. We haven't met in forever. Our budget, our banking account looks like this. Our budget looks like that, but we can do it. If there's a will, there's always a way.
Let me say this. It was 2 points when I heard both of all of the pastors chiming in, but one of the things was I believe that a lot of the pastors in a lot of especially our smaller churches don't know how to speak to these secular leaders. They don't know how to converse with the money holders, the pocket book holders, and so they are intimidated. to their point, and then this intellectual gap that we may have in some of our smaller churches. If you have churches where many of those who are educated go to one church, then that leaves a gap in many of the other churches. And so I think that even those small churches, and I don't want to be long, but even in those churches or those pastors who may feel intimidated, to the point of those other pastors, don't be afraid to ask for someone to be an intermediary or someone to be a liaison from your church. You got to ask for that help, because if that pastor feels intimidated by having to talk to the local state rep or the local mayor or whatever, they will not do that. And the funds are available if you know how to engage those relationships.
That's correct.
That's right.
And I think there has to be a level of willing to take risks.
Absolutely.
Because when I shared the vision for the virtual learning, it was not totally embraced by everyone, even in my own congregation, because, it's like, oh my God, everybody gonna catch COVID. There is a fear factor. And
right.
So we have to learn how to be fearless leaders and answer the call that has been placed on us and walk in it. And so I had to be firm on my belief that this was what we needed to do. This is what we were called to do. And then I had to be prayerful about it, because I was like, okay, Lord, I'm walking. Don't trip me up. I don't want nobody to come up positive. I don't want that, we're doing all of the guidelines. We're following all of the procedures, and it's a challenge, because one thing I have learned in this short time that we've been back together, virtual learning is a challenge. I feel for parents that are doing it with multiple kids in their home, because all of the kids' schedules are different. So it's not like you're in a classroom and you have a classroom of 35 fourth graders and you're teaching them all the same. Every kid class starts at a different time. This class is ending. They're on break at this time, but the next one's not on break. This one's at lunch on one time, and the next one is at lunch on another time. It has been very, very, I want to say challenging. But we have felt comfortable that we are up to the challenge that we have to be, because our kids already suffer from a learning gap. And if we allow them to sit at home unattended, unsupervised, it's our kids, our African-American kids of color, who will not just have a gap, it will be like they fall off the cliff. And that's not well with my soul.
Well, I like what you're saying. I like what you're saying, Reverend Powers. And what I want you to talk, because you're kind of taking us into our next question, which we really need to get into. That is how you talked about when you first brought this idea to your congregation, it wasn't 100% well received. Can you give can you all give some examples on ways in which you can approach, that a church leader can approach a congregation about something like this? Because a lot of people are still afraid, that they're going to catch it, and, they don't want to take the risk and the liability. How do you approach? What are some ways to approach your congregation? In interested persons in trying to start a ministry like this?
Well, Dr. White, one of the things that I think we as a church family in Sparta, I have all the educators, and they don't mind, because it's their community, it's where they live. And they've educated kids their whole life, and so I don't have that issue with them coming out and wanting to teach their children in their community. The only issue that we have in our area, in the rural area, is poor internet connection, You have to do so much to get a good internet connection just to do online services, or even at the church when you're at the church and you're teaching kids on the computers. If your internet service is not working right, then it's a poor session. But I had to, as a church leader, my church wanted it, and so what we did.
When it came to the question of the internet connectivity, you knew you had to improve it. How did you? I mean, the congregation. How did y'all go about that? How did you knew you had a weak connection? So as a congregation, how did you all come to a solution about that?
Believe it or not, it was because we were having an AME meeting and they needed the internet. and I said, well, y'all can't have these people coming to our church and the internet ain't right. And y'all the educated church. So let's just be real. I mean, if you want me to be real.
The answer I was looking for, but okay.
I know, but that was the real answer.
It was the real.
But what happens is they knew we needed it. They knew the community needed it, because even school doesn't have a great internet connection in Sparta, Georgia. So you have to boost your internet connection. Most people in Sparta don't have a whole lot of internet connection, and we had to fight the company to come out just to put the internet service in. They don't even want to come out.
Oh my goodness.
And so,
for those that may not be aware, Sparta, Georgia that's down in South Georgia. Is that correct?
No, that's actually west.
West, okay.
Going towards Augusta.
Oh, going towards. It's quite rural.
It's really rural, and if you got a dish network, it's raining, you can forget watching TV. I mean, it's really, really rural. And it's one of the poorest counties in the state of Georgia that most people don't realize. They land rich, but economically poor. And so it's going to take a major industry to come through there to even, I mean, the only major industry we have is a rock quarry and a prison.
So were you able to boost the connectivity, the internet connectivity, and how were you able to do that?
We actually had AT&T come out and put the little devices up, and it boost our connection, and had to pay a little more. That's all. I mean, but it was worth it, because we want to teach kids. We want our kids to learn. Even in Sparta, when we started our tutorial program, the school doesn't have books. And I couldn't believe that the school didn't have books when they were in school. And so, like most of us, we pull our resources in, and I called a couple contacts and said, hey, I need some algebra books, I need some economic books, I need some history books, and we got some books to the students just so they can learn. They were learning off of copied paper.
Wow.
And so go ahead.
So really opening the eyes of a lot of, especially the viewers. I know mine are getting open because, by me I live in the city of Atlanta. And so I am, I'm sensitive to the issues of that are plaguing our inner city youth. But I can only imagine what it's like in the rural areas in terms of what their resources are or the lack thereof. So that's quite a testimony that you have. Reverend Powers, tell us a little bit more about how you approach your congregation, in the hopes that maybe there's some leaders out there that can learn something from yourself, your experience.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to give the answer that they may be wanting, because I feel like leadership is something it's developed over time, and you have to have in order for you to lead people, they have to trust you.
Amen.
Especially when you want to lead them boldly, when you want to lead them fearlessly. So this wasn't the first time that I've challenged them to do something that was, maybe not, it was outside of the box. And they saw that it could be successful. and that I was not leading them just for the sake of any glory of mine, but I was leading them. This was the right thing to do. It was right for the church. It was right for the body of Christ. It was right for the community we were in. And therefore, there is a trust factor. And they know I'm leading them with integrity. So when I really talked to them about this, and there was some like, and I said, okay, what are the concerns? Let's talk about it. We talked about it. And then let's talk about what we are really called to do. And so once you laid it out before them, and then the people who were willing to step up and lead, I had a one-on-one conversation with them. I said, listen, if you're uncomfortable with this, we won't do it. You're both considered an at-risk population from age, not just from ethnicity. But if you're not comfortable, I don't want you to do anything you're not comfortable with. And they're like, Pastor, we with you. And so it just becomes a thing that you have to lead in this way, even when it's not challenging. If you just wait for when the challenges come, and then you want people to follow you, they're not going to do it. You got to lead consistently.
Well, you bring up a very strong point about when I was in seminary, we studied in church administration. We studied a thing that they call from a book called How to Get Along with Your Church. You may or may not have read that by Dr. George Thompson, and he talks a lot about having what you call culture capital.
Right.
That means that you have established a level of integrity and trust among the people that are there, and they understand that you have a vested interest in their well-being, and they believe in that. And so those leaders and those church leaders and those pastors who are out here listening to this broadcast, if you feel that you have that level of trust and integrity from your congregation, you're certainly in a position to do what Jesus did with the 2 fishes and the 5 loaves of bread.
Yes, ma'am.
And it may seem impossible. It may, you're putting yourselves at risk, but in the same spirit of what Jesus did with the 2 fishes and the 5 loaves of bread, if you have that, if you have that desire and the Spirit is speaking to you, you certainly can do something. Dr. Fortson, do you have a perspective on how how congregations can go, or how churches can go about approaching their congregations?
Absolutely. I was thinking about it when you asked the question, and I called it a plain, practical plan. A lot of times pastors have initiatives, and a lot of times leaders have initiatives, and they're great ideas, and they try to articulate them. And in a lot of instances, they're either talking over the people's head, or they are not speaking that plan in its most plain and practical terms. And I think to actually have a plain, practical plan for doing this kind of work in such a way that the congregation understands it and can build trust in that plan. I've seen congregations in my consulting that love their pastor, love the leadership, but this particular plan didn't make sense. This particular initiative didn't make sense to them. And while they loved them, they did it for a little while, but it did not have sustainability. And so I think being able to write it down, I think the words of the text that says write it and make it plain, I think is the first thought. And again, when you're talking about an education or an intellectual gap in many of the churches, they don't have the necessary resources in order to even create that plan. How do I write this down? How do I put it in something that can be digestible by our congregation? But then the second thing I thought about, and it was interesting that you brought up culture capital, because I was thinking sociology of religion, the pew pastor. The one
Yeah.
there's two
Yeah.
pastors in every church. The one in the pulpit and there's one in the pew. and I don't care how great your initiative is. If you don't get buy-in from the pew pastor, they'll kill your initiative in the parking lot.
That's correct. That is correct.
They'll kill it in the parking lot. And so the wise pastor knows who that pew pastor is, the one that got everybody's ear in the church, and get them to buy in as well. Talking about knowing your congregation or how to get along with your congregation. And if you can, a lot of times, if you can get the pew pastor on your team as the senior pastor, you can get a whole lot of things through. You can get a whole lot of progress if that one influencer in your congregation is not, holding it up, is not blocking. So those were the two things I thought of. Plain, practical plan. It's good to say it from the pulpit, but if you can write it down, if you can make it as plain in its most digestible terms so that the congregation can embrace it, can digest it, that's good. And also knowing who that one influential character is in your church that you need to get buy-in from, who can then send the influence, who can send that to the rest of the congregation as an agent of that initiative. So those are just my two thoughts when you brought it up.
Well, those are certainly valid observations, and definitely knowing who the pew pastor is.
Who the pew pastor is.
We know about that in the Black church for sure.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that the concept exists in all other denominations as well.
Absolutely. They in every church.
Yeah. Well, we're drawn to the end of our dialogue. This certainly does not end the dialogue, because this is going to be an ongoing issue for a long time. We are almost at the middle of the school semester, almost. And for some schools are starting out 100% in person, and they're having to switch to the hybrid. And so there's some concern now about that lag in education, which is another conversation. There's also some concern when I spoke to educators a couple of weeks ago about when it's time for standardized testing. How will this affect the school score for that? So I'm saying all that to say that we are going to continue this conversation. We've had a very fine hour with some fine pastors who are doing things to impact the educational landscape. And I'm certainly grateful for Reverend Powers, Dr. Fortson, Reverend Christmas, Dr. Henderson, and Reverend Houston for their contributions for tonight. And we're getting ready to close out now, because we want to make sure everybody understands that that there are some ways in which the church can actually be an impact on what's going on in education right now, and not so much just allowing our congregations and our church buildings to sit idle and be empty while we wait on some signal from whomever or wherever to say, hey, it's time for us to go back into the church. That I have a problem with that. So there's Reverend Powers. But until then, I want to thank you all for listening, and thank you all for watching. A special thanks to Keisa Public Radio. And as we leave you, please remember those famous words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening. Thank you to our panelists for tonight, and I look forward to having this conversation, continue this conversation again on at a later time. On next week we will have the Women's Laboratory. On the Women's Laboratory, we will be talking about all of the controversial issues surrounding politics and voting. And among other things. So please tune in next Thursday at 6:30. Reverend Powers will be back with us. We're hoping to have Reverend Houston to join us again. And we have a panel of some very dynamic ladies that will be joining us in enhancing that conversation. Until then, thank you so much for listening in.
What's poppin'? Miss Evans on the beat, so tap in. You got options, but you better pass my class, no flopping. Gon' log in every day, every morning I'm watching.